Thank you. And thank you, Rev Larry, for having me up at the pulpit. And thank you, Fisher, for being here next to me today. I am Becky Laster, and I am the chair of the Human Rights Task Force here at First Unitarian Church. Last year, many of us discussed the book, The Sum of Us, What Racism Costs Everyone and How We Can Prosper Together by Heather McGhee. The 6th chapter is called Never a Real Democracy. This chapter details how our nation was founded so that only a select few were eligible to vote. Our election system systematically excluded women, African Americans, Indigenous Americans, those who are poor, and young people from voting. All of these groups had to fight for the right to vote. And although our nation saw success to expand voting to more diverse groups so that we could build a representative democracy, these gains have been eroded over time. Our Supreme Court gutted the Voting Rights Act, after which many states reignited voter suppression laws. Also, the Supreme Court allowed big, dark money to influence our elections. Heather McGhee put it this way: America has repeatedly attacked its own foundations. From voter suppression to the return of a virtual property requirement in a big donor-dominated campaign finance system, a segment of our society has fought against democracy in order to keep power in the hands of a narrow white elite, often with the support of most white Americans. We witnessed this again when our capital was overrun by a mob attempting to overthrow election results, and to this day, many believe the 2020 presidential election was rife with voter fraud. Our democracy is resting on thin ice. These problems seem so big, and it may feel like we might not be able to fix them, but we must face them. We can't give in to cynicism. We must choose hope instead. And I'm happy to report, First U chose hope through action. We participated in a strong UU the Vote campaign spearheaded by the Unitarian Universalist Delaware Advocacy Network, or UU-DAN. UU-DAN partnered with Reclaim Our Vote and the Center for Common Ground to write nonpartisan postcards to infrequent Black voters in southern states. These postcards encouraged voters to vote, registered voters to vote, and provided them with county election information. First U, along with the 4 other UU churches in Delaware, sent a total of 8,240 postcards. In Alabama and Florida, we wrote to encourage people to vote in their primaries because people who vote in primaries are more likely to vote in the general election. In Virginia and Georgia, we encouraged people to vote early and avoid long lines. We also reminded Georgia voters to bring water with them because Georgia has a law that advocacy groups cannot bring food or water to voters waiting in long lines, even if they're 3 or more hours long. I want to personally thank all First U volunteers who got involved. There were people counting postcards for me. There were people delivering postcards for me. And of course, there were many, many who wrote postcards. And we wrote at home, and we also this time got to write here in church, which was fun to write together at our summer camp and at coffee hours. But all this writing, all this time, does it really matter? Here's one headline from the Washington Post, that our work did matter in Georgia for this midterm election. More people voted early in Georgia than in the 2018 midterm election, including Black voters. Additionally, Reclaim Our Vote says, our postcards help build a democracy that prioritizes the voices of all people. And if that's not enough to show that this action matters, I always think about the people we are writing to who have traditionally had their votes suppressed. I believe when each one of the 8,240 people who received postcards from us, we honored their inherent worth and dignity. Each one of them, we provided them hope that their vote matters. This action expanded hope rather than giving in to cynicism. I feel great that we encourage voting in southern states with so much voter suppression. However, Reverend Larry has been telling us to also look in the mirror. It's not enough to think voter suppression happens only in southern states. Although we now have early voting in Delaware, we were unable to successfully pass expanded voting and same-day voter registration and vote by mail. Some may think that access to voting through these types of laws are not real barriers to voting, but to those whose votes have been suppressed, laws that increase access to voting do matter. Voter registration laws have been used by states systematically to target and stop Black people from voting. And vote by mail expands access to voting for many citizens, especially those who work low-wage jobs. Delaware's Constitution limits the reason citizens can vote by absentee ballot. To expand voting in Delaware, we need to amend the Delaware Constitution. Last year's legislature was fully aware that we needed to amend Delaware's Constitution, but they were unable to get the votes to do so. Instead, in what I would call a game of sort of political theater, the legislature passed same-day voter registration and vote by mail, and immediately these laws were taken to court. And the Supreme Court of Delaware struck them down. In this instance, and in my opinion, the courts overturning these election laws erodes trust in the election system and causes confusion. So we have work to do right here in Delaware to expand voting to all Delawareans. We need to pass a constitutional amendment to get that done. And I hope that when we have our new slate of legislators, everyone here contacts their legislator to discuss the need for this constitutional change. There are many organizations advocating to strengthen our democracy here in Delaware. Last year, the ACLU spearheaded the advocacy to change the Delaware Constitution to allow no-excuse vote by mail. I expect it will be active with this issue again this year. The League of Women Voters of Delaware encourages informed, active participation in government and influence public policy through education and advocacy. American Promise is working to pass a United States constitutional amendment to overturn Citizens United, and our Delaware chapter advocates with our Delaware legislature to support this amendment. Our own John Claney coordinates an effort to bring ranked choice voting to Delaware. And UU Dan gets involved in local advocacy about election policy and many other public issues that UUs face and that UUs value. We have meetings every month by Zoom. Look for them in your e-news. I would really love to see you there. I will end with another excerpt from The Sum of Us. Heather McGee quotes Professor Nancy McLean, who has studied how powerful the opposition to democracy is. Even so, Professor McLean remains optimistic and says, I think good people of all backgrounds are starting to get into action to try to defend democracy. And I'm heartened by the way that I see so many people, including not having expanded access to voting, through same-day registration and no-excuse vote by mail hurts some of our fellow Delawareans. And that means it hurts all Delawareans and weakens our democracy. As a predominantly white congregation, I hope that we prove to be some of the white people she speaks of by acting to strengthen our democracy through local advocacy with our state legislature. And also, please don't forget to vote. Go today. I'm going right after this service. It's the last day for early voting, or go on election day, but please don't forget. Thank you.
Thank you, Becky. So Becky and I stand before you today in a long tradition of election day sermons and editorials. Originally, of course, these sermons were actually on election day. And over time, they're given before an election in Unitarian Universalist congregations and other congregations of other faith traditions as well. The late Forrester Church, who was minister at All Souls Unitarian Church in New York City, when reflecting on the origins of this tradition of the election sermon in New England in the 17th century, summarizes that there was a lot of fire and brimstone in many of those original election day sermons. He writes, "At least the listeners only burned for to feel at least partially responsible for everything that was going wrong in the world. No more throw the bums out because the bums were us." Well, relax. I won't be speaking for 2 hours. And yes, rest assured, I will point out, as Becky has as well, that we are all in this together. As Becky also pointed out, many of us have joined with others to encourage voting in this particular election. The task before us, even beyond Election Day as well, is to stay engaged in the advocacy and the continual work of raising our own voices, and also to help amplify the experiences and the voices of those who otherwise might not be heard. Thank you, Becky, for agreeing to speak to us today and for encouraging our heart and emboldening our activity, even past Election Day as well. Now, let's be clear. Of course, I'm not going to tell you who to vote for. Besides, many of you have already voted for this midterm election, or couldn't wait to vote, or could not be swayed in any direction, in any case. And so I'm not going to focus either on any current political candidates. Yet, I do have something to say about this moment that we are in. So why even speak about the election in church? I can answer that. As Unitarian Universalists, we proclaim in our fifth principle that we affirm and promote, and I quote, the right of conscience and the use of the democratic process within our congregations and in society at large. Consequently, we understand that the encouragement and the safeguarding of the democratic process is not just about politics. It is a religious duty for us as well. Reverend Parisa Parsa states in her commentary on this fifth UUA principle these words. She says, put them in the right direction. Democratic process is our liturgy, the work of our people, and it is holy work. While worship is our collective act of celebration, affirmation, challenge, and inspiration, it does not ask of us what attending an annual meeting, for example, does. Experiencing our worship without participating in the community's decision-making is to comprehend our faith superficially. Voting is the shorthand for taking interest in and ownership of the process by which we as a community live out our faith and choose to use our collective power to shape our world in accordance with that faith. It's a sacrament. May we guard and protect our democratic process, deepen and strengthen our individual consciences, bound by the commitments of our faith, so that we might all grow into greater union with the divine. To be able to be informed by our own conscience in the public square means that we do not support coercion. We do not support the false manipulation of information. We do not sit idle while fanatical thinking is occurring all around us. We advocate not just for a broader access to the right to vote, but also, and I hope you stand alongside of me, we also encourage an atmosphere in which our sacred duty to care for the common good can be done through democracy, not autocracy, through democracy, not authoritarianism. It's not a coincidence that so many of our town meetings and votes in some New England area towns occurred historically and still do in many of those towns in congregational or Unitarian Universalist meeting houses. For it is these very same settings that the democratic process is practiced in congregational meetings as well. I remember being among the first 18-year-olds who were able to vote in a presidential election and how seriously and earnestly I approached that responsibility. I remember canvassing for my candidate who did not even win his home state. But that did not deter me or dissuade me from further engagement. I foolishly thought that the Voting Rights Act meant that the access to voting and the atmosphere in which elections were held would be enshrined and not erode over time. Becky has pointed out to us that's not the case with the Supreme Court decision. Freedom House, which some of you may know about, which studies and rates countries around the world with their objective criteria around democracy, concludes that the United States has experienced a multi-year decline in its democratic norms and institutions. All of these, the Supreme Court decision, the efforts that have happened since the 2020 election to restrict access to voting, all of these changes which have disproportionately impacted Black, Hispanic, and Native American communities, all of these are only symptoms of something much larger. These are only symptoms of a larger pattern in our country and in other countries around the world. In their best-selling book, How Democracies Die, the authors Daniel Ziblatt and Stephen Levitsky point out that since the Cold War, most democracies have not been overthrown externally by violent military coup, but internally, through ballot box and the subsequent capture of political institutions by autocrats. They assert that the tragic paradox of the electoral route to authoritarianism is that democracy's assassins use the very institutions of democracy gradually, subtly, and even legally to kill it. Please take note of these 4 key indicators or behavioral warning signs across many countries of authoritarian behavior that can lead to the suppression and even the death of democracy. 1, the rejection in words or action of the democratic rules of the game. 2, the denial of the legitimacy of political opponents. 3, toleration or encouragement of violence. And 4, a willingness to curtail civil liberties of opponents, including the media. Sadly and alarmingly, maybe you recognize that we have seen all of those behaviors in this country most recently, and they still continue. The time we are in is a critical time, as we probably a most critical time we've ever faced as a country. We need to heal our democracy while it still has breath. I believe our congregations can be places where we practice and uphold civility. Whether we are progressive or conservative, whatever political party we identify with, our common religious task is to heal the wounds of our democracy for the sake of future generations, for the sake of the earth, for the sake of the mess that we are in that erodes our civil discourse and undermines our civil institutions. One of my friends, mentors, and teachers, Parker Palmer, recognizes that many of us have become what he calls accidental rather than intentional citizens. Voting, canvassing for particular candidates that could move us in the directions that we value, donating to candidates, getting out the vote, all of these are absolutely essential for democracy to work. But he argues that this accidental and episodic democracy that happens every certain number of years with a vengeance is no longer enough. I believe that because of these trends that we are observing and experiencing in our own country, that we should be concerned about the access, obviously, to how to make important decisions for the common good. And I also know that I'm not alone in my concern about the atmosphere in which we are now engaging in the discourse and the decisions about our future leaders and our future directions. When I think about the current state of politics in this country, I worry that the whole atmosphere in which we attempt to have discussions, make decisions, and decide on future political leaders has been severely altered in ways that many of us could not have imagined. Am I alone in this? Our capacity to do the democratic process, in my mind, is furthered by these qualities: safety, sincerity, and sanity. Not much to ask for. So instead of safety, we often have fear these days. Peter Marty, in his recent article in the Christian Century magazine, offers this commentary. To frighten or intimidate another person into believing that they may be seriously harmed is appalling behavior. It's vile rhetoric that sets a dangerous path for democracy. Plenty of dictators throughout history have excelled at controlling people by violent threat. What's metastasizing in our day is the mainstreaming of menacing political rhetoric, discourse specifically tailored to instill fear. In fact, we know this. We've heard stories of physicians or scholars or poll workers or judges or librarians or officials at the FBI or in the Department of Justice, even leaders of the National Archives, experiencing unprecedented levels of violent threat. And I believe our capacity to actually engage our conscience in the democratic process also requires that we aim towards sincerity. Instead of sincerity, we have succumbed to what some have called a post-truth politics. We even had a former leader who's estimated to have crossed the line with about 25,000 lies while in office. When we have climate crisis denial, COVID disinformation, and election deniers, all of these poison the atmosphere of our democratic engagement on the decisions that matter about our future. Otto Scharmer says there's a collective sense that, quote, no one can trust anything or anyone, which translates into no one can know anything. This is not the perfect environment for us to practice democracy. And I believe that we need an atmosphere of sanity. Oh, I desire an atmosphere of sanity. I long for an atmosphere of sanity in which we can do this democratic process. Instead of an atmosphere of sanity in which we have our discussions, decision-making, and voting for our future leaders, we have a proliferation of conspiracy theories that amplify people's confusion, fear, anger, and fanaticism. Do you hear what I'm saying? So somehow or another, we're needing to work together on restoring the qualities in the atmosphere in which we do our democratic work that includes safety, sincerity, and sanity. Is that too much to ask for? Yes? No? So our congregation, I believe, our congregations can be greenhouses for cultivating these conditions for the development of conscience and for the exercise of the democratic process. Our congregations are places which we can intentionally engage in practices of safety, sincerity, and even sanity. Indeed, this coming Friday and Saturday, a significant number of our members have signed up to participate in the Reimagining and Reclaiming Our Future Strategic Summit. Over 85 people have signed up. The guidelines and the process for this summit include practices, I think, that help cultivate and deepen the atmosphere in which we can do our democratic work with safety, sincerity, and sanity. I'm going to share. This is the preview. I'm going to share some of the guidelines of those conversations with you now. Make sure that everyone who wants to be heard can do so within the time available. No speechifying, where one or a few people can hog the airtime so that others may not be heard or feel drowned out. Writing down the input from each participant, each speaker, so that we can actually see and affirm their voice. Involve an intentional cross-section of the congregation, as many as can be managed within the time that's available. Elicit perspectives from young and old, new members and longer-term members, those in leadership and those not. Engage in the practice of dialogue, and I want to put like 5 highlights on this particular guideline. Dialogue, where we're not just advocating for our own positions, but we are open to being influenced and impacted by what we learn from others. These and other practices need not be constrained to this intensity of this summit. In fact, it's my hope that we can have a takeout order on all of those and bring them into the various contexts of our own lives, where we work and where we live. There's no doubt that we need to not wait around until others practice civility and democracy before we dare to do so. We've got to practice now. Story to share. Soon after I finished this sermon, I went out for a walk in my neighborhood, and one of the first persons I encountered had a sweatshirt, a kind of lime green fluorescent sweatshirt. And on the shirt it said, "Trump won, Fauci lied." I did not give him a neighborly smile. I did not pet his dog. I didn't ask, what did Trump win? I didn't ask, how did Fauci lie? I didn't invite him for a cup of coffee at the coffee shop right there. Friends, the Lord is testing me. I need your prayer. That was a hard encounter, one like many that many of you I know experience with family and friends and neighbors. I may have failed in that particular encounter. So maybe everything I said this morning belies that particular event, but I just wasn't quite up to it. But you know what? With your support, with our continual practice, with our engagement in these kinds of practices that I outlined, maybe the next time I see a lime green sweatshirt coming around the corner, I might be able to stand there, at least pet the dog, maybe ask in as curious a way as I can, what did Trump win? And see where that conversation may go. So the title of my sermon, Make Them Hear You, comes from a song taken from Ragtime that we'll be hearing shortly. It's a song that I wanted to give you a little bit of the context, but I think for the sake of time, I'm going to hold off. But it's a song that I think, as we recognize in the play, Coalhouse Walker Jr., who is a successful black piano player, sets off a revolt after his wife is shot and killed by police for simply trying to shake the hands with then President Teddy Roosevelt, who was processing down the street. We know all too well the racial violence that continues in our country. We know all too well the attacks, violent attacks that people have made on those that they disagree with. And this song is Walker's legacy in the last scene of the play. It's kind of an anthem. It includes these verses. Go out and tell our story. Let it echo far and wide. Make them hear you. That's your part. Make them hear you. Say that after me. I'll start over. Go out and tell our story. Let it echo far and wide. Make them hear you. How justice was our battle and how justice was denied. Make them hear you. Go out and tell our story to your daughters and your sons. Make them hear you. So may it be. Amen.